Okay, well we're constantly told really that the idea of class is no longer relevant for understanding the world around us. This is something that's pushed from the top of society all the time. But I think at the current moment it's quite a difficult argument to make because you only have to kind of look around for a minute to see that actually what we're experiencing is a real revival of the notion of class division is one that can explain what's going on around us. So you look at the rise of Corbyn, you look at what's happened at Grenfell, the language of class is alive and well in this kind of situation. And I think this can express itself in that growing feeling of class inequality, that real sense of them and us is now, particularly through the Corbyn movement, feels like a common sense idea. But the idea that workers are the sort of agent for change in that situation, a key force with the power to win demands in this new insurgent movement, this is something that I think really is not a common sense idea. And so I wanted to start the meeting really with the question of why does it matter? Why is it important to ask whether or not the working class has lost power? And you look at Marxism this year, and an overarching theme really, the festival, is a world in turmoil. And whether you think back over the last few years, from the Brexit vote, Scottish independence, Trump, the rise of Corbyn, or even just over the last couple of weeks, you can see the spectacular transformation that's played out. The word turmoil really feels like it's quite a fitting way to sum up the situation. And so the context for today's discussion is one where the capitalist system is in continuing chaos, throes of a deepening crisis, and the ruling establishment is really failing to hold sway. So the moment kind of feels quite poignant, feels quite alive with that incredible hope, encapsulated in that manifesto that enabled people, for the first time in a long time, to really envisage how society could be different, how they could, hope and demand actually a better life, a better kind of world. And so, that's encapsulated in what we've seen around the Corbyn movement, this huge hope that people have. But then you have Grenfell and this real bitter class anger, the million and one ways at which at every turn, every opportunity the ruling class took the decision, the Tories took the decision to kill us at Grenfell and put profit before working class people's lives. So I think we're in a situation where, between that and the terror attacks we've seen, everything else, there's quite a lot of disorientation as well as that anger and as well as that hope. And so people are asking a lot of questions, I think. And we have to ask really, what's the answer? Is the answer, getting Corbyn elected, and is that going to solve, the problems that we're seeing in the world today? And, we have to say that would be an absolutely fantastic step forwards for us to get a Corbyn government in this situation. But even if you ponder it for just a moment, it's quite easy, really, I think, to see that getting the Tories out and getting Corbyn in is only going to be the beginning of a quite major fight that we're going to have on our hands. Whether or not the ruling class is going to simply sit back and allow that kind of transformation of society that's outlined in that manifesto is a question that we have to ask, and I don't think that they are. I think you can look at examples like what we've seen playing out in Greece in recent years that show that really it's power inside this system lies in the unelected institutions, the bankers, the bosses associations, who have absolutely no qualms about disregarding and dismissing democratically elected governments when they feel that their interests are threatened by that, when they feel that profit is threatened. And so that question about, what is the answer, how can we fight for those demands, and whether or not the working class is a force that has the capacity to stop those attacks, this, actually is kind of the most important question to be asking. But it feels an odd time to do this meeting in some ways because, in some ways it feels as if the unions have been not really at the centre of that huge movement we've seen around Corbyn, and there's a historically low level of strikes. It doesn't, although there's this big movement that's hopeful and determined and looking at ideas of socialism and so on, actually it doesn't necessarily feel like that's going to come via strikes or via organised workers. And so I think there's something quite interesting about that whole thing about socialism becoming a popular idea again, something that's projected into the mainstream, because it's created this kind of disorientated outrage on the part of some of the most kind of reprehensible establishment figures. So I don't know if anybody saw, followed what happened at Glastonbury, and obviously this fantastic Glastonbury Corbyn moment that takes place. And quite quickly Nigel Farage is on Twitter completely exasperated and tweeting saying, oh, this, do they know what this is about? They should go and Google Marxism. They don't have a clue what they're getting behind here. This guy's, this crazed Marxist or whatever. And it was quite refreshing. Someone tweets back, oh, I've just gone and Googled Marxism, and thanks, Nigel, I think I'm a Marxist, and so on. So, the point I'm making, though, is that at a moment with the left on the rise, you have not just socialist ideas, and the idea of people before profit and a different kind of society being thrown up, but also people are asking questions about how we get that, and people are Googling Marxism. And so I wanted to kind of clarify what we mean by class briefly, just because, in terms of a Marxist understanding, would tell us that the working class is the force inside capitalism with the power to transform the world. And you look at capitalism today, and it spans every corner of the globe. It's undoubtedly a global system. The working class are the class that's in the majority under capitalism today. But if you go back to when Marx and Engels were writing in 1848, capitalism really was just a baby, kind of. The working class was only 2 to 3% of the global population. So you kind of think people must have thought they were a bit mad at the time when they're talking about workers of the world unite and pinpointing the working class as the force that could change things. But they were quite confident to do that because they could describe how the driving development of capitalism was a process where the system creates its own gravedigger. It was a process that was dependent on the expansion of a working class across the world that had actual collective economic power inside the system. And this is because the whole system is based on the exploitation of workers. So you have the minority who own the land, the machinery, who don't produce anything themselves or don't really do any of the work themselves, but they live off the exploitation of workers who have to sell their labour in order to survive. And that exploitation of workers means that they're paid a wage less than the value of what their labour produces, and that surplus is taken away as profit, and so on. So an example of this really, people might have heard of the Fight for 15 movement. Obviously I've seen large-scale strikes and so on going on over there. A McDonald's CEO in the US is paid 1,000 times what one of the workers in McDonald's is paid, even though that wealth is wholly created by the labour of those workers turning up every single day. And so you can see in that, when workers don't go to work, we have an incredible power if we're collectively organised and if we're deciding to take that kind of action. The profits of the system are utterly dependent on our labour. And another point about exploitation is that the conditions of exploitation in capitalism are constantly launching new series of attacks. People talk about a sense of a precariat. Actually, really, the whole condition of the whole working class is precarious by nature. At any point, we're at the whims of a ruling class that's continually going to try and attack us based on the balance of how the system is doing at that point in time. And so those conditions of exploitation do constantly create a situation where people fight back and people are forced into a position where they resist. But the outcomes of those struggles really are completely up for grabs, and I think completely dependent on how well organised our side is, on whether there's a strategy that can overcome the boss's very organised attempts to smash that struggle. And so, you look at that slogan, "We are the many, they are the few," and it's a good slogan because it builds that sense of we are the many. There's more of us than there are of them. But also Corbyn's manifesto is not just about being for the many; it's also about not being for the few, and it creates that sense of class division and that sense of tension. And I think what we have to add to that is say, yes, we are the many, but we also do everything in society, so we have a power there. But I think one of the questions that's thrown up a lot around the question of looking at class today and the working class is that, particularly in an era with such a low level of strikes, we're not really seeing on any kind of mass scale the working class fighting back. People have that kind of 1970s image of the powerful collective of miners or dockers or factory workers walking out because the boss looked at you wrong or something. That kind of sense of a powerful working class feels like it doesn't really describe the world of work when we look around us today. And also, as I've said, you look at that movement around Corbyn. I mean, the mass youth vote, the huge rallies in Gateshead. It just really doesn't feel like the unions have been so crucial to that process. And my flatmate, who actually herself is a union rep, said something quite interesting about this recently. She was saying, at work it's really hard to get people to join the union. It feels as if the union's quite weak at work nationally. At best, it's doing nothing. At worst, it feels often like it's getting itself into all kind of situations that are pissing off workers. But so it feels like when I talk to people about joining the union, it feels abstract. It doesn't feel like why is it worth their time and money? They can't see it as something that's fighting back. But then she said, when I talk to them about Corbyn, about why it's worth voting, about actually going out and canvassing even, it feels like instantly it connects with people because there's a sense that they can see Corbyn out there fighting for ordinary people. And I think that was quite interesting because it underlines something that at the moment Corbyn makes people feel powerful and feel hopeful and feel like they can see change. But without that sense of workers' power collectively, without that idea that we actually have a capacity to do it for ourselves and the system can't run without us, not only do you kind of have a situation where people feel that the working class has lost power and it's no longer that image of what it was in the 70s, but also you also can feel like, well, it doesn't really matter because there's this exciting movement going on and isn't Corbyn great and look at him, he's wonderful and we're going to get him elected, and then the Corbyn government's going to bring in this manifesto that we've all rallied behind. And so I think, you know, that's the kind of problem that we face at the moment, is trying to fight to say why this argument is a relevant argument about the power of the working class. And I think feeding into that common notion of the working class today is a whole series of arguments about, really over the last few decades, you know, the forward march of neoliberalism, how you know, changes have taken place inside the working class that have actually rendered it powerless. And so I wanted to spend a bit of time looking at some of those arguments. The first one really is the idea, you know, it's most recently been reflected around all the kind of stuff on the gig economy, the headlines and studies, but that sense of, you know, now we're all 0 hours contracts, we're all casualised, you know, we're kind of atomised and powerless. And casualisation is this huge problem, and if you know, listen to what Frances O'Grady, the TUC General Secretary, has to say about it, then you might as well pack up and go home. It just feels like, you know, she kind of seems to think at best we can beg the bosses to give us a little bit of, you know, to be a bit nicer and be a bit gentler about pushing through this casualisation, as if they're going to listen, you know what I mean? But I think, you know, there was a Guardian article recently, well not recently actually, but it sums it up quite well, so I want to use it as an example. And you know, in the article it says, you know, today's digital capitalism is creating a world of consumers delighting in apps for a cheap taxi or delivering groceries to their door. But it's also creating a world of disempowered workers who have to labour in this on-demand world, the gig economy, in which a working week is no more than a series of gigs contracted out by online dispensers of on-demand work. And so you can get this kind of sense of, you know, quite a departure from what you would understand in terms of the working class, and this is apparently rife at the moment. And so I think this comes on the back of a series of arguments that have emerged over the last few years, which go back to, you know, I want to go back really to say to Guy Standing's Precariat in 2011, which by no means was the first, you know, point of these arguments being discussed, but it felt like a moment where, you know, the idea caught hold about a precariat, and it was something that got taken up in the movement more widely. And, you know, essentially he describes the precariat as a new distinct class with distinct interests from what he describes as the proletariat class. And so you get this sense of, you know, a kind of, you know, casualised workforce, and then you have this kind of workforce that maybe could be seen as relatively privileged in relation and so on. And, you know, I think that the separation here misses the point that actually, you know, a lot of the best organised sections of workers today were once the most precarious. So the dockers are the obvious example of this, where you have dockers forced to fight each other on the, you know, this is not very different from what happens when a McDonald's boss texts out, you know, 200 workers for a shift that they need 2 people for or something. This is not a new thing really that we're seeing. But it also misses the connection, I think, between those two groups. The fact that casualisation of work, unorganised groups, shifts in the dominant industries and sectors inside capitalism are nothing new. This is something that's been a part of capitalism since the beginning, since the beginning of the system. And you can, you know, look to the new unionism of the 1880s or the 1930s in America and Britain, and you can see, you know, really combative struggles that threw up, you know, a situation where whole new areas of places where people were very precarious became organised. So I think it's very dangerous for us to start identifying workers who are unorganised and therefore, you know, the worst pay, the worst terms and conditions as a distinct class, but it feels like we need to kind of reference it because that notion of a precariat, I think, is a very strong one in the arguments that we face today. There's also then the question of 0 hours contracts, and I think, you know, rooted in both these discussions really is that sense that capitalism in the last couple of decades has thrown up new methods of working that are enabling it to get over that power that the working class has. And underpinning that really is a sense that, you know, that Marxist understanding of class isn't really relevant anymore in the 21st century. And you know, in a situation where we're seeing mass political movements but a low level of class struggle, that can actually, you know, you can feel the tide is already moving that way in terms of not seeing the working class as powerful, and so these arguments kind of feed into that. And I think it's a very ideological argument. You know, you look at, for the bosses and the ruling class, for them, and of course their system wouldn't work if they had an entirely casualised workforce, so it's, you know, there's a hype around it, but for them it's a great way to promote the kind of dynamism of capitalism, you know, create this sense that we're all atomised individuals, and break any sense of collectivity that could see us actually effectively fighting. And you see, I don't know if people follow it, but all those kind of articles and so on in the liberal press, you know, it's like chirpily kind of celebrating them doing away with rights that have been fought for by the trade union movement for over a century. You know, maternity rights, minimum wage, sick pay, holiday pay, all these things, and you know, encouraging us all to kind of celebrate our entrepreneurial spirit, our newfound flexibility. And it's talked about often as if, and people should see the recent thing that Deliveroo has put out about, oh, it would like to, you know, Deliveroo would like the government to reframe, you know, casualised work, because their workers just really love the flexibility that they get from the job that they do. So while they'd love to, like, you know, change it so that they can give these workers basic terms and conditions, then, you know, that can't be done under the current setup. And so, yeah, we constantly are faced with that argument. And I think there's a real danger on the left of us just automatically accepting this logic, which often comes out of an anger at the conditions workers are finding themselves in. But there's a danger at just accepting this logic of a great surge towards casualisation, 0 hours contracts and so on. And you know, Frances O'Grady and what she said is a reflection of that. Because it can lead to a very pessimistic outlook that just sees the advance of neoliberalism as something that's unstoppable, where, you know, strikes are seen as either not possible or completely ineffective. And I think secondly, even if you start from the point of saying that workers in the gig economy and on 0 hours contracts can be organised, and we absolutely should start from that point, if you accept that kind of view of it, it can often lead you to a position where you're trying to organise them in a complete kind of separation from the existing unionised sections of the workforce, which actually is undermining the process. I mean, if any of the McDonald's workers or you know, Glasgow fast food workers are in the room, then they'll tell you how much it helped them actually build the union when they had a striking lecturer come along to their meeting, or a striking janitor come along, and actually vice versa. These are, you know, when the teaching assistants came to Unite the Resistance conference, they said it blew their mind to go to the session on organising the unorganised and listen to the Ritzy and the fast food and you know, the Unite Sports Direct and so on. So, you know, this is a dangerous thing for us to separate these things off from each other. So I want to kind of say a little bit about the reality of the extent of both the gig economy and 0 hours contracts, because that's what we need to look at really. And I don't have time to really do that in any level of detail, but I just wanted to point to, you know, one report which is, you know, like many reports that we see on this stuff, which was by the McKinsey Global Institute in 2016. And, you know, if you read the headlines for that, if you took those figures at face value just from looking at what the report says, it kind of implies that somewhere between 20 and 30% of the working age population are in independent work. So that just feeds into this sense of, oh my God, the gig economy, it's everywhere, and you know, we're powerless now. But actually, it kind of wildly skews the real picture of how big an element the gig economy is. Because if you look at actual self-employment, it's 8% of the working age population of Britain and 15% of the workforce. So it's hardly a situation where, you know, I mean, the reality is the vast majority of people remain in traditional employment. And the term self-employed as well, which I think comes out in a lot of these reports and so on, is an incredibly broad one that incorporates a whole lot of different experiences of work. So it lumps in people like the Deliveroo riders, who are essentially workers who've been robbed of their employment rights, with people who are running their own businesses and you know, making profit and so on. But it's the employers really who have an interest, I think, in relabelling us as self-employed, because they want to be able to deny us the basic employment rights. So people might have followed the GMB case of the Uber taxi drivers, where they actually took them to court and demanded that, you know, they were saying they shouldn't be recognised as what was it, a mosaic of 30,000 small businesses. And I thought it was quite interesting that the Employment Tribunal judge, you know, hardly somebody who's always on our side in these things, described that as something that was faintly ridiculous in their eyes. You know, this idea that, you know, these people were all running their own independent businesses linked by one common platform. So, you know, you can see that this is a quite skewed picture if we just base it on reports. Looking at 0 hours contracts, you know, there's a lot of talk about this in a way that I think is quite positive, because it's about trying to expose the absolute scandal of 0 hours contracts, that, you know, how shit it is for the workers that are working in those conditions. And, you know, when John McDonnell says in a New Statesman article that precarious jobs and 0 hours contracts have become the norm in huge sectors of the labour market, you know, he's doing that in a situation where he's actually been at regular meetings of the fast food campaign. He's stood beside fast food workers when they're outside protesting. He's somebody who's been part actually of an active process inside the trade union movement of pushing for the unions not to be passive on this question, not to throw up our, you know, hands and say we can't do anything. But the problem is, it isn't exactly true that 0 hours contracts have become the norm. I mean, if you look at the latest ONS statistics, it's actually fewer than 3% of the UK workforce that classes itself as being on that contract as their main job. So we've got close to 1 million on 0 hours contracts, and that's a 13% rise in a year, which can feel quite significant. But there's a likelihood actually that because of this kind of increased awareness around 0 hours contracts, that'll have fed into the figures in quite a big way. So you know, you have to sort of take that into account as well. And over the past 3 decades, temporary employment has risen by only 0.3%, so it now stands at 6.3% of the workforce. So once you start to even begin to look at what the reality of the situation is, you can see that the perception of growing precarity of the working class is actually much greater than the reality that we're seeing. And you know, it's worth kind of asking why is that? Why do we feel that way? And I think it comes out of a situation where, you know, both the level of strikes are very low, we're not seeing resistance, you know, austerity is absolutely hammering people, there's a rise in food banks, you know, our NHS is under threat, you know, social care, everything feels like it's just been ripped away from us really. Pay's been frozen for so long. You look at, you know, a whole number of different housing crisis, for example, people's lives do feel very, very precarious at the moment. And I think that can feed into a sense that an argument that says that we're all suddenly, you know, there's this huge shift to precarity inside the working class. It can feel like it accurately describes our experience of life at the moment. And I think while, you know, you recognise that the extent of precarious working is overstated, and that's a point that I'm trying to make really, it's also important that we see these as areas that we can actually organise. So we have examples of 0 hours workers at Marxism who will, you know, be speaking tonight at another meeting, and examples of workers inside the gig economy where they fought back and really blown out of the water the notion that we can't fight and win. And I don't have time to talk about, there's lots of examples of this actually, but I'll just talk about 2. You know, McDonald's a couple of months ago announced that it was going to put its 115,000 workers that have, you know, 90% of its workforce has been on 0 hours contracts, that those workers would be offered the option of going on to a fixed hour contract. Now this is quite a big deal, and I think that we have to say that's not at all separate from the process of beginning to organise in that industry. You know, actually the initial announcement that they made about that came the day after a global day of action around Fight for 15. But here in Britain, you know, new Bakers Union members in fast food came together, they dressed up as evil Ronald McDonald's, they rampaged through the city, they held a precarious work picnic, I hope some of them will talk about it, and they made the front page of national press in Scotland, and the next day there was this announcement. So, you know, I'm sure there were many motivating factors for that announcement, but it definitely fed into the confidence of the workers in that branch, who were all completely new to union organisation. It was one of the first things they'd ever been involved in. You know, quite interesting the level of creativity that can be thrown up sometimes. You know, I think when they told me and one of the union organisers that was what they were planning to do, we sort of went, I don't know what that is, but they were absolutely right. It was a very, very visual and incredible, you know, incredibly creative protest. But I think the most inspiring example, actually, as people will know about it, last year there was a week-long unofficial walkout by the Deliveroo riders, and you know, this was because they were being threatened with being put on a contract that would essentially remove the hourly rate of pay, and they'd only be paid for, you know, they'd be relying on the fees paid for each delivery job. So they walked out, and you had this sense waiting for them on one of the protests, and you thought, God, they must be so atomised in their day-to-day experience, turning up on a bike, checking into an app, you know, one rider going around doing all this work on their own. And I was thinking, oh, I don't really know what to expect here. And then suddenly you kind of, round the corner, they all kind of glided in, this kind of mass collective of them all on their bikes. They had placards stuck to the back of the bikes. They were, you know, chanting and cheering and all this kind of thing. And it felt like this very visual illustration of the fact that even the Deliveroo gig economy, you know, riders clearly still had a collective power as workers. And, you know, this was almost entirely migrant workforce as well. So I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm worried about the time now. But I think that, you know, there's another side to this argument, which is the whole argument about the decline in manufacturing. You know, the sense that, you know, look back to the 1970s, all those real jobs in manufacturing have been replaced with something, you know, casualised, or, you know, there's been a shift to the service sector, and, you know, this is how workers have lost their power. But it's actually important, first of all, looking at manufacturing. Despite the decline in manufacturing jobs in Britain, the output actually hasn't declined. So what you actually have is a much smaller group of workers producing the same the same output. So instead of actually taking power out of workers' hands there, that actually puts it in a much smaller, in some senses more organisable group of workers' hands, and so actually in some senses it increases the power that the workers have in that section of the workforce. In terms of the shift to the service sector, this is often seen as well, these aren't real jobs because they don't really have the same kind of relationship to at the point of production and so on. But actually, you look at the public sector. When the teachers went on strike, aside from the fact that actually the bosses do care about having an education system or a health service or all these things that can keep the system running, actually that impacted in a way that had a whole number of different people not going to work. It then impacts on the profits for the bosses, those parents that couldn't go to work because in the health service and other sections of the public sector at the moment, you can see that any action taken by workers, any strikes that take place, actually have an added element of political power to them because of the austerity attacks and everything else. So actually, far from this being a situation where people don't have power, in some senses it's a highly unionised section of the workforce that's very, very pissed off. That's often at the point of the worst attacks inside of the austerity agenda, and that when they strike they get an amazing response. So you can see that from the junior doctors dispute, you can see that from the reaction actually around the latest stuff about the pay cap, when you think about the role of firefighters in the NHS and how they've come to be seen as like a kind of symbol of humanity in this kind of brutal world around us. And I think people are, that rage about the pay cap now has become a new level of boiling point of rage. It's a real live wire, I think. I'm not going to have time to talk about offshoring, but I think that this is often put as an argument that because bosses, if there's say there's a union strikes and so on, organisation going on in a particular part of the economy here, well, the bosses can just up and move sticks to somewhere else where workers aren't as well organised, where the conditions are worse. But actually, there's a whole series of arguments for that I don't have time to cover. But one thing I would say is that if you look at the example of China, where there's been a whole series of kind of strikes taking place, whole sections of workers that had never been organised before, actually, we shouldn't just accept that premise that even if offshoring is something that's taking place, that it means that it's immune from workers' struggle. So I tried to kind of quickly look at a whole series of arguments that are made at the moment that say that the working class has lost its power, and I think that we can see that there are answers that explain how this is not quite the case. So if the working class hasn't lost power, if it is still a force with the capacity to fight back and assert itself, why isn't it doing that at the moment? And I think just to take a look at the balance of class forces inside Britain today, the latest figures that we saw come out about strike levels, about union membership, really confirm what we already knew, which is that it's at a kind of all-time low. That if you look at 13 million trade unionists in 1979, now there's around 6 million. All this can kind of feed into a sense of decline and weakness and so on that I think dominates the top of our trade union movement, and that's a kind of pessimism that permeates its way down, feeding into lack of confidence among workers at a rank and file level. And it's clear that if you look at the strike levels, trade union membership and so on, undoubtedly our unions have a massive challenge laid out, and it is a kind of existential question for the unions. But that sense of kind of spiralling steady decline, I think, is something that's not at all inevitable, and this is the argument that I think we need to be taken up inside the unions. We have a period right now that's characterised by a very politicised mood among working class people, but there hasn't yet developed a generalised consciousness where workers feel their own collective power within that. And there's a whole lot of stuff you could say about the assault of the 1980s, what Thatcher did, the defeat of the miners' strike, how it was this moment really that kind of reverberated right across the working class at a moment when workers did feel powerful, when workers had taken on the Heath government, when people were used to strikes, winning things, and this was a kind of really defining moment that in a sense broke that idea of our power. And we haven't really had the opportunity for that to fully recover since in any real way, and the role of the union leaders inside of that process I think has been absolutely defining in holding back struggles that could have broken out. For example, the 2011 pension strike was a massive moment where I remember the picket lines. You were standing on a street corner where on every corner there was a picket line because it's the public sector. People felt just beginning to get a little glimpse of that sense of, whoa, there's a lot of us and we're shutting things down today. And the marches were big, and it was very, very political. And what we've seen since then really is a whole series of setbacks where the union leaders have pulled back from the kind of action, the kind of possibilities that we've seen open up because of how politicised people are and how angry they are. The union leaders have pulled them back. You know, the junior doctors dispute is the latest kind of tragedy in a string of them. And so it can start to feel a bit ridiculous actually in a moment like the current one, because first of all, 6 million people is a significant force. You can do stuff with that, especially if you're a force that organises and runs everything in society. But let's remember that 6 million trade unionists, 13 million people voted for Corbyn's Socialist manifesto. So you have a situation where there's a huge, huge audience out there who could join unions quite quickly if the unions really implant themselves inside that insurgent movement, and this is what we need to fight, as socialists at this festival sitting here now, to go back out and do and say, come on, this can't be business as bloody usual. Look at the scale of crisis that the Tories are in, and look at how hopeful people are about a different kind of way of running things. We can't let this moment pass us by. So, looking at the balanced class forces, we've looked at our side and we're not in the best state, we're not confident, we're feeling a bit like we're not as strong as we should be, but we do still have power. Then you look at the ruling class, and it's kind of phenomenal to look at what's taken place. If we weren't so furious about the DUP being parachuted into the parliament and this bigoted party being given this legitimacy, or if we weren't so sickened by what's happened at Grenfell, then all you want to do is just laugh at what's happened to Theresa May, really, because she didn't even need to call the election. She chose to because she had the 20-point lead. She felt confident that she could do two things. One, shore up her own position inside the Tory party at a moment where they're going into Brexit negotiations where they're completely divided and tearing themselves apart on it. And two, increase the Tory majority so that they could smash any sense of a hope around Corbyn, demoralise the movement, make sure that he's no longer a Labour leader, all these kind of things. And then you just have kind of three phrases that I think sum up the great fall of Theresa May, which is dementia tax, wheat fields, and coward and murderer, which is what was shouted at her when she tried to go into the Grenfell community. And so they're in this spectacular crisis, and we just can't allow them the opportunity to regroup. It made me really, really sick to watch that Parliament session of all them jeering in the way that they do inside the Parliament, voting through to continue the pay cap. When you think about the firefighters that went into that building, the NHS workers, that I know somebody who knows an NHS worker who's one of the victims of one of the London Bridge attack and so on. These are it makes your blood boil when you think about it, and we have to make sure that people's blood does continue to that we do continue to keep that anger and keep pushing inside our unions to make sure that they don't let that moment pass by. And I think Alan was saying the other day that the question that we have to ask really is, why aren't the unions seizing on that Glastonbury spirit? That was fascinating to watch all the crowd, up on, with their beers in hand, cheering Corbyn, and the old Jeremy Corbyn chant and all this. This is a moment really where the unions could completely transform the situation and make a kind of historic leap in terms of rebuilding union membership. But there's nothing inevitable about it, and if we don't fight to make sure that they implant themselves in that movement, then we're going to miss that opportunity. And I think Corbyn summed that up really on the People's Assembly demo. He said that what's happened is we've unleashed the ideas and the imagination. It's unleashed the day-to-day conversations on every street corner, every cafe, every pub, about how differently we could run society. And that's right, and I think we need to say it's also unleashed those conversations and those discussions and that imagination inside every workplace. And so we need to be fighting to make sure, as socialists, we're in there fighting for that, kind of current of thought that says that we have power and that we can fight, but also pushing the unions to do so. And I think we can picture quite easily, if you look to the next few months, which who knows what's going to happen, but if we do end up with a situation where we have a Corbyn government, you can see how quickly that's going to become, history is moving very quickly at the moment, I think, because of the crisis of the system. And so very, very quickly, the bosses, the bankers, we already saw some of them lining up saying, if he tries to do anything about Trident, well, we're not going to do that, and so on. These people don't care. They're going to mobilise, like they did in Greece, to make sure that those changes aren't implemented. And so if we don't have our side organised, our side which is, we do everything in society, it doesn't feel like it, but we have this huge collective power, we actually can win. We can win the demands in that manifesto and much more. And one of the most beautiful moments for me in the election campaign was when Corbyn was at that 10,000 strong Gateshead rally, and he said a lot of brilliant things. But one of the things he said, and it wasn't even so much that he'd said it, it was the reaction in the crowd, was about this idea that we have to fund the arts and you know, culture and so on, because every child should be born into society where they're encouraged to, you know, to develop their creativity and so on. And it, you know, it was just really beautiful watching how much people loved that when he said that, because it was that sense in people that we do want £10 an hour, we do want a health service that's not at breaking point, we do want pay that we can live on, but we also, you know, we want bread and we want roses too. We want to have the ability to enjoy life, the ability to be creative, to do all these things. And that's the kind of better world that I think that we're all wanting to try and fight and that, you know, and build. We're only scratching at the surface at the capacity for humanity under capitalism. And you know, we do actually have the power to build a different kind of world, and the working class is absolutely critical to that. So I think it's very important to have meetings like the one today to take on those arguments that says, you know, the working class is a force that has power, and we want to go out there and, you know, we can see that power. We might have not seen the scale of strikes that we need to demonstrate in one swoop what power we have because of the union leaders holding the struggle back. But we have seen little examples. So when the ASLEF train drivers went on strike, those trains didn't move. And you suddenly thought, oh, or the Barts cleaners, who people, you know, they wouldn't have seen themselves necessarily as some kind of powerful workforce with economic power and so on, but when they were on the picket lines, the hospitals aren't getting cleaned, and you suddenly realise these people are, you know, pretty bloody important to the running of a hospital. And so when struggle opens up, we start to get that sense of our power, and I think we have to fight to make sure that we can get that kind of struggle, because, you know, when our side's organised, we can fight to change the world.
So the first speaker is this chap here, and one at the back.
I'm Robert. I'm a Unite Rep at St George's Hospital in Tooting. I was with Julia on the picket line on Tuesday. It was a brilliant picket. About 200 migrant workers, mainly Afro-Caribbean workers. It was a carnival atmosphere, and you had the London Secretary, if you like, Peter Kavanagh, going down there and saying he could reach 600 members. He's got 8 new reps. But I also want to, a word of caution. This Peter Kavanagh was the same Peter Kavanagh that sold out the bus workers' strike. They're going for a London-wide bus ride. And basically he pulled back on that to get Sadiq Khan elected, so you can't trust the union leaders, and he didn't build the thing. It's an active, actually, you need active a network of activists in a workplace builds strikes and builds membership. It's not the trade union bureaucracy.
Yeah.
If people come down the front to speak, the next speaker will be the chap with the hat there.
It's good that you talked a lot about the possibilities and taken on some of those arguments about the way that our class has changed, and you know, some of the arguments around the precariat and that very, very important. Nevertheless, though, it is true that we, you know, still things being built, there's still manufacturing. For instance, in Oxford, we've been involved in intervening around the BMW dispute. Now, I spoke to some workers on the picket line there. It's quite lovely really, they were reminiscing about the last time that there had been strikes at the Cowley Park, the Cowley car plant was in 1982. And it so happened that those workers were going to be hit the most over the attacks on workers of BMW's pensions. They were the ones that are likely to win, those are the ones that are likely to lose something in the region of £160,000 at the closure of their pension scheme. So it's a very, very large attack. Also, the idea that these bosses couldn't afford it. I mean, BMW can't get minis out of the bloody plant bloody quick enough. They are record car sales and record mini sales that is completely reliant on the workers at that plant. They have paid out £10 billion. Oh, you know, this is since the recession, by the way, at a time of austerity and so on, and at a time of us kind of getting the neck. These people have seen their dividends go up by something like 11.5 times. So, you know, the money is certainly there. I have to tell you, though, very, very sadly, that maybe I'm wrong, but it looks like that is going to go down to defeat. That strike was suspended in favour of a ballot that was put to members over over what the union officials said was something they needed to put out there because some people would do well, some people wouldn't. As it turns out, basically, it's a terrible bloody sellout, and worse now, they kicked it out, and now they're putting the same deal to them, £22,000 or £25,000. But basically, what BMW have said, what the bosses have said, you vote against this, you vote for strike action, we'll sack you and re-engage you. This is a massive attack on our class, and where's our leadership? We've got Unite is one of the biggest, it's the second biggest union, 1 million members, more than 1 million members around the country. Lynn McCluskey called for kind of escalation of strikes over the Oxford bus dispute, double the strike pay. He's not doing that now, and that's the kind of pressure that we need. So it's that energy from those places in the so-called precariat that we saw from those LSE women last night, from Willie Howard and so on, another union. If we had some of that kind of energy and that kind of militancy, I'll tell you what, BMW would be shaking in their boots.
Chap with the glasses,
yeah, I think it's right what the last chap just said, because I think any picket line you go to at the moment, it's not the case that you turn up to a picket line and you meet 2 or 3 really miserable, ground down individuals who really don't want to be there and are really trying to work out how they're going to get back in the door or the gate or whatever. It's just not like that. You know, the Bart's picket lines massively inspiring, the LSE picket lines massively inspiring, the protest by the cabin crew, you know, the lively protest, they look exactly what you want a picket line to look like. The thing is that I think it is about a question of leadership, and I don't think union leaders are providing what we need in this situation. I don't think it takes much imagination to think about what that might be. And sometimes I also think that actually, you know, John McDonnell, sees a moment there, doesn't he, when he talks about 1 million people on the streets, which is absolutely what we want. That's exactly the thing that can give people the confidence over the questions of strike action and so on. But there's something holding that in check, isn't it? And I think part of what's holding that in check is the bloody parliamentary Labour Party and the likes of Chukarimla who are about to stab Corbyn in the back at any given moment with it. So I think it's on both sides of it. What I'd like to see is the likes of Len McCluskey, Dave Prentice, you know, these old white men in suits, but actually it's about politics, isn't it? Because let's look at Jeremy Corbyn, for example. That's what speaks to young people, is the question of politics in this situation. Taking a lead and making their unions look and sound a bit more like Jeremy Corbyn does at the moment. That's the way to recruit young people. There's some basic maths here. 6 million people in the trade unions, 13 million people voted for Labour. Go out and recruit them. Go out and recruit all those people to the trade unions, the young people that voted for Labour. There has to be a massive raising of sights and pressure on unions. But I'm a bit encouraged, actually. I think the likes of Prentice and Roach and McCluskey are not completely stupid on this question, because I just got an email from Dave Prentice where he's talking about how there has to be a summer campaign over the question of pay. It has to be political and industrial. We will not waste the summer waiting for Parliament to reassemble. And talking about how the last part of the quote is we've got to get our members to rise up. I know a few people, they happen to be SWP members, that might have had something to do with that statement coming out from Prentice at this week's Unison NEC on the back of Saturday's brilliant demonstration. But we need a bit more of that, don't we? We need people pushing from the bottom up, using the excitement that's on these picket lines to create a generalised surge forward to take on austerity and neoliberalism. And that's the way we can get ourselves back in a position. I don't know if people remember, last point, is that, you know, a few years ago everyone was talking about the idea of generalised strike action. At the moment, where do people see the unions? The point is you can use what's going on with Corbynism to rebuild that sense of class confidence.
Yeah, I've been coming to Marxism for a number of years, and I was thinking when Guy Standing in his precariat mentioned the number of meetings and discussions we've had about, you know, various commentators arguing similar things. You know, Standing in his precariat, you know, this separate, distinct class, I think, has been well dealt with. you know, Deliveroo and Uber, you know, it's the perfect answer to you know, what he was arguing. But if you go further back than that, you know, to the end of the, I think it was the end of the 1980s, you had Andrew Gortz, as some of you remember it, famous, infamous book, Farewell to the Working Class. You know, essentially, capitalism, he's arguing, you know, is so successful that the working class has essentially lost its role as agent of change. And since then, we've had a number of other meetings at Marxism. We had Antonio Negri and Michael Hart's this amorphous concept of the multitude that replaced the class. Recently we had Paul Mason's book, some of you remember that, the post-capitalism book, where he is arguing this ridiculous notion, in my view, that what he calls the network individual, right, the working class lost its power, called the Mason, the network individual will then join up with the state, and believe it or not, the capitalist class, in kind of delivering some kind of vague form of socialism. Absolute kind of nonsense. And refuting all of that, I wanted to widen it beyond what we've talked about today and look at the kind of global nature of capitalism, because at one level it looks pretty awesome and pretty powerful, but therein for me it contains the seeds of its own destruction. Some of you might remember in 2016 we had the general strike of Indian public sector workers. 180 million workers on strike. I can't get my head around that number. In other words, the working class is not shrinking. In a global sense, it is growing massively. And in that sense, and so is the trade union movement, and in that sense, its potential power as a force for change is growing massively. Even closer to home, public sector strikes in 2011 were mentioned. I was involved in that as a teacher in the EIS, and I'm going to give them a plug. In Scotland, we've got roughly over 2,700 state schools. On the day of the strike, there were only 33 schools left open, state schools left open. What incredible power a small group of workers can have. That's the key about it, in terms of the working class as an agent for change, the potential power that it has to actually change society in a dramatic and a radical way for the best. The very final closing point, this year is the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and it's right that we celebrate it. It's right that we've got meetings at Marxism on that and later in the year. But when we celebrate it, let's have a confidence in our class, the working class, the exploited class, as a class that actually has the power, as the agent, the motor for change in society. And a key aspect and element of that is, of course, the trade union movement.
Aubrey Evans, Chesterfield, SWP. I'm a volunteer with the Unite Community, and I work with teaching migrant workers at Sports Direct English. Quite a lot of stuff over the last year or so about Sports Direct and some of the battles that we've fighting and some of the battles that we've won. And we have made a lot of gains over the last year. But earlier this year, Mike Ashley started a process of automisation in Sports Direct, laid off a lot of workers. Like Julie said earlier, the process actually, it results in two things. It actually concentrates power into the hands of fewer people. The people that operate those machines have a lot of power. But at the same time, it laid off several hundred people, which means that the rest of the workers are actually fearful of losing their jobs. And that's the fundamental problem. It isn't that workers have lost their power. Workers at Sport Direct actually have a lot of power. They could bring that place to a halt within hours. And when you've got a lot of these orders are based on internet orders and getting deliveries to shops within 24 hours, they exercise a lot of power. But the problem is they are frightened to use it. And that is doubly so for migrant workers who have no family network locally that can give them support in times of difficulty. And that's why I think in some ways we have to be more imaginative in how we get people into the union movement, how we build up their confidence, and how we get them to be able to fight back. Things like the English project are good in that they build the relationship between the union and the workers. We can find other ways of hitting back at workers. But it makes it doubly difficult to organise, and even the people that want to join the union get themselves sufficient positions in the union as local chair, secretary, or whatever, are actually frightened to tell other people that they're in the union for fear of being victimised. And that's the fundamental problem. It's not that workers don't have the power, they're frightened to use it.
the question when I hear it, and I hear like the working class hasn't got this power anymore, I always say this little phrase, as it bollocks, we have got the power. And you know, Tuesday, yeah, I'm going to be standing outside of Amazon in Colville, and I'm going to be unionising some of the workers there, you know, and I stood out there the last week, yeah, and everyone who walked past me was keen on joining the union, no matter what Amazon are trying to do. These are workers who walk 13 miles on a shift daily, and they want a union, and people are, you know, but I always think there's a phrase that reminds me by Frederick Douglass: power concedes nothing without a demand. And it's time that we started demanding things, demanding a different society, demanding that 4 million children don't live in poverty, demanding that we don't see a spike in homelessness, that we don't see public sector services ransacked, that we don't see the NHS like privatised, that we demand £10 an hour, we demand decent working conditions. So it's time that we rise like lions from slumber.
Yeah, I think we have to remind ourselves that we come from 40 years of neoliberal politics. As Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan laid the foundations of the neoliberal order to come, they inflicted bitter defeats on the trade union movements in the US, in Britain, but also internationally. And it's in that context where the likes of Negri, the likes of Laclau appeared, and rather than seeing a lack of a struggle as a consequence of neoliberalism, they came to see it as a permanent fixture of current contemporary capitalism, and they gave up on class. That's shifting now, and we have seen brilliant examples here in Britain, the picture house workers, the cleaners in the LSE and so on. But I want to talk to those who don't know about it, about a recent example from the Spanish state. A few months ago, the dockers announced, well, the leadership of the union, after the dockers exerted pressure, announced 3 days of strike following an announcement by the government that they were going to liberalise the sector. Now the dockers, I mean, something like 60% of national imports and something like 80% of national exports are carried out in Spanish ports. So that caused massive disruption, and it was only 3 days. Within weeks, when the bill to liberalise the sector was voted in Parliament, it lost because several parties who first had pledged to support it shifted and voted against. Really, you know, that's not going to challenge the neoliberal agenda of the Spanish Tories, but it will give confidence and hope to others in different sectors facing the same attacks to join the movement and go on strike. I think it's worth knowing that one of the bosses from the port said on a radio program, as this was happening, that, well, first he said that dockers can't have these privileges in the 21st century, but then he went on to say that they have become aware of the value of the goods in the ports, and that has led to an unsustainable situation. That you go, the class still has power.
I think there's far too much kind of superficial discussion around the question of the kind of modern working class. So there was a program I heard on the radio the other day. It had some good things to talk about, delivery workers and so on, but very casually it just said, of course, in the modern world, in Britain today, there's been a fragmentation of work. You don't have big workplaces anymore. It's all divided. this simply isn't true. I mean, not only is there no evidence that the average workplace is smaller than it was 30 years, I mean, you think about it. Hospitals, big workplaces, places like Amazon that the comrade about, new workplaces with hundreds and sometimes thousands of workers. I was talking to a comrade from Brighton, Steve Guy, who's worked at Gatwick for many years, asked him how many people work at Gatwick, 25,000, right? When the workers of the Paris Commune rose up to take power, that Marx celebrating as an example of the revolutionary workers' state, the average size of the workplace was 7. I think we do better than that in Britain today, right? And equally, if this argument about the precariat becoming the dominant kind of experience, you would expect, one of the things you'd expect to see is that the turnover of jobs, that people move, they're not in stable jobs and so on, they can't organise together because you're constantly working with different people. Average job tenure, how long people are at a job, has increased, it's not fallen, because people are a bit scared of losing jobs. So there's no evidence of some kind of, most people, not everybody, but most people in Britain, we're talking about 30 million people at work in sizable workplaces, sometimes in very big workplaces, on permanent contracts with the same people most days. Right? That's not the totality, but there's still a huge core of millions upon millions of people. So when it was announced during the general election campaign, you might have missed it, but the government's figures suggest that union membership, after stabilising for 5 years, fell by over 250,000 last year. Francis O'Grady of the TUC's response is to say the problem is, it's all precarious work. This is an excuse. It's an alibi. It does not rise to the responsibilities. And I think people are absolutely right. The key question we face is, what do the unions worry about? Declining membership, lack of engagement of members, and the ageing, the age of the activists getting older. Well, guess what? Look at Corbynism. Look at the young people, look at the engagement, look at the... Here's a template of how you might do it, right? And they're chanting Corbyn's name. They're not chanting Dave Prentice's name at Glasgow, right? I'll tell you what, they might have chanted Arthur Scargill's a generation ago, because if you fight, if you lead a serious battle, you offer people a vision, you get the engagement and so on. Therefore, the key question for us, not an easy one by the way, how to take that spirit of Corbynism into the workplace, because the locus of radicalism at the minute is not, unfortunately, the workplace. It's around politics and Corbyn and Labour, but it's the same people. They go to work, it's the same people. How do you take it into the workplace? Oh, I'll tell you what, here's a bridge that you might want to think about, the pay cap. It's extraordinary that the pay cap has become the headline news. That seems to me like a trade union issue. If we're not going to fight over pay now, and by the way, the public sector, there's a big concentration of trade union organisation, we have to go crazy agitating that there should be a fight. The worst that will happen is that large numbers of your workmates will agree with you and you try and build out that. The best that can happen is we start to put pressure on them to have some kind of fight in the autumn.
Just quickly say that, a few years ago I was enjoying myself in a Wetherspoons and I watched this spectacle of one of the workers cleaning away a table, and within a few minutes this supervisor guy marched out, visibly angry, started, showing the guy, you're cleaning the table, you need to do it like 50 times more intensively, like he was a sort of Olympic table cleaner. I think it was humiliating, really. I think you have to say, and it really demonstrated where the power was in that relationship. And I thought, Jesus, I hope in that situation I'd lamp him or something. That's where people can find themselves, and I think that's the whole question of power in the workplace is, for me, that's really central. My own experiences pushed me into socialist politics. Partly that was because getting told to do bad work by my manager I found that really offensive and hard to take that. I couldn't actually do the work the way I thought it would be best to be done. And I think we haven't really talked too much about what that power could mean in terms of occupying workplaces and work control inside workplaces and democratising our workplaces. So as well as trade unions are part of that, but it can't be the limit of what we want from workers. I think that's my opinion.
My name's Arthur Scunthorpe. I would like to talk about workers' rights. People should be paid what they're worth, not what their job's worth. Too many 0 hours contracts, too many people working for peanuts for next to nothing. I'll give you one example. A nurse working in Hull Royal Infirmary for the NHS has had to be giving her job up to go and work for Aldi, which highlights the public sector everywhere. which living standards are being squeezed. And this is all incorporated in what's happening with the public sector pay freeze. It's affecting everybody. And I think it's time that everybody galvanise together to stand up for what they believe is right. Fair day's work for a fair day's pay. That's what I'm saying. Not for just a few, but for everybody. For every cleaner, sweeper, cleaner, road sweeper, everybody. Everybody that works in the care sector, they're working for nearly next to nothing, doing jobs in half an hour and getting paid nearly next to nothing. It's not good enough. This Tory government has absolutely destroyed people. People have got no hope, no desire anymore to work because they're so put off by the way that this government is hitting the lowest paid. But I say this, people need to be paid the right wage, the right amount of money. Give them an incentive to work. And I'm talking about everybody in this room. I'm talking about all workers. Not for those at the top, for those that are here looking at me. Thank you.
The woman in green, she'll be the last contribution, then we'll call Julie back.
I'm sorry I'm the only woman who's got up to speak, because obviously we are half of the workforce, if not more. But I wanted to tell just a very positive story about something that happened in Southampton last year. People may or may not know that Esso has a massive refinery just outside Southampton. And decades ago, the workforce were badly paid, badly treated, no surprise. But they got together and they won over a succession of actions what they called the Forley rate. And what the Forley rate said was that if you were working in Esso Refinery Forley, you got paid the Forley rate. Didn't matter if you were washing the floor or, as my husband was, an electrician who was making sure the plant was working. You got the Forley rate. No questions. The contractors got it, the full-time employees got it. And then unfortunately in the 80s, the majority of the workforce were easily bribed, sadly, to give up the right to have their unions negotiate for them. They could be union members, but there were no negotiating rights. Since then, you won't be surprised to hear that the Forley rate had dropped considerably, conditions worsened, and so on and so forth. However, last year, Esso brought in a workforce from Italy, I think it was, to carry out particular work. And they were not getting the Forley rate. The Forley rate didn't exist anymore in theory. And the contracting staff working for Esso, so not direct employees, but under contract from other employers, threatened strike action if the Italian workers didn't get paid the same rate as they did. And they won, without having to go on strike. So, that shows that there is still that strong feeling, even in what is now no longer, might be unionised, but no longer has the union power theoretically, they can still do it. So, you know, don't go away from here thinking it's all doom and gloom, because it's not.
Start with that idea of power that somebody was talking about the, you know, the table cleaning and so on, and you think about, you know, the experience in most people's jobs, and this is definitely the case in, you know, bar work or, you know, jobs that are unorganised and not unionised, but I think it's also the case, you know, in most people's work, that sense of like you go into work and you're, you know, the kind of micromanagement that goes on and the amount of like, you know, attempts to kind of, you're constantly kind of pushed into this position where you know, you can't even make the most basic decisions and you're being undermined constantly, and it's like, it reminded me of a conversation I had with the two organisers of the migrant strikes that we had at the opening rally last night as we were walking down to the bar, and they were exchanging experiences of organising, and they were kind of, you know, talking about that sense of the frustration when you know, when you come out on strike and people just don't kind of have that kind of tradition of what the strike means. So like they had like one cleaner who was like, I'm absolutely there, the strike, I completely agree with it, I'll be on the picket line, and you know, yeah, I'll be there for that part, but then I've got offered like some overtime for this other shift, so I support the strike, but I'm going to do that. And they were like, no, that's not what a strike is and stuff. So it reminded me that sense that you have a whole kind of tradition to re-win with people, because just so many people don't have any kind of experience of that kind of action. But the discussion was a very, very interesting one, because then they were talking about, you know, how simple it is, just don't go in and then you'll shut down the workplace. And you think, well, actually, no, people do live their lives, especially cleaners and people in that kind of position where you're going in every single day and facing that sense that, you know, you go in to kind of submit yourself to this higher authority and so on. And one of the things that's fascinating about the Barts cleaners strike is that is definitely the case. I mean, even on the picket lines, you turned up and they were, you know, buoyant and marching around, and they were spontaneously chanting "Workers United will never be defeated." But then you saw like the level of intimidation from management. There was like real bullying, horrible management right in front of you on the picket line, you know, threatening people, all this kind of stuff. And you think, oh wow, that's how have these people managed to shift from that position to this one? And you know, Willie, the organiser who was at the opening rally, was talking about, you know, the contrast. And you know, it's like people aren't idiots, and when the union organisers go into the workplaces, if you go in there and wave a form in somebody's face and say you should join this because, you know, you should be in a union, and you don't really give an argument, you know, people are just like, well, why is it worth the bother? You know, I'm gonna get hassled for that. Actually, I'm not going to do it. Whereas what he's done, you know, actually there's 700 people who joined the union in the last 6 months or so in that dispute, and it's because they've gone in, there's been an unofficial walkout, they won on the question of breaks, and they've said we want to fight on the question of the breaks, and we want to fight on pay, and we're going to call a strike, and we want you to join the union, and we want you to, and you know, so people think, well, actually, yeah, that's worth my while. There's a point in me doing that because you know, because you know, I'm actually being offered a strategy for how I can do things. And I think that kind of feeds into that gap, really, that there is between the huge kind of surge around Corbyn and the, you know, the level of activity and enthusiasm and everything that's there, and going back to what a flatmate had said about the, you know, it's harder to get people to join the union, that kind of thing. And you think, you know, this is such an incredibly hopeful moment, and so many people are kind of joining the Labour Party, and you think, well, surely, you know, we can just all, if we all join the Labour Party, we'll fight to shape the Labour Party, and then we'll get Corbyn in, and like, why is there a need for any kind of other independent organisation or so on? And I think some of the stuff that Alan mentioned actually about, you know, and people have touched upon about that need. Why don't the unions call a bloody national demonstration and say that they want to get 1 million on the streets? Why don't they do something over the pay cap? God, if they called national generalised strikes at the moment over the pay cap, you know, there'd be a huge mood around that. Can you imagine? And that would in turn transform the position that Corbyn's in and what he's able to do. And actually, you know, that it was SWP members that sat down before they went into the Unison NEC meeting and talked about how they could engage with the situation to push to get the union leaders to do more. And at the Bakers Union conference, it was SWP members who sat down, who are, you know, fast food workers, and organised to put in an emergency motion calling for a national demonstration for the TUC to call it. And John McDonnell came in off the back of that and said that there should be 1 million people on the streets, it's in the Mirror and so on. So I think that it points to something about, you know, why do we exist and what are we trying to do? And, you know, you look at, you know, Corbyn says we need to learn from history, that, you know, all the rights that we've had are the only rights that we have are the ones that we can defend. And you point to the civil rights movement, the vote, you know, the 8-hour day, all these different things that have been won over time have come from mass movements from below, from strikes, from working class people coming together and fighting back. And so we definitely have to do that, and we want to be part of a movement to get Corbyn in, of course we do. But, you know, we know that those big questions are going to be thrown up, and we know that we need the organisation that can actually, you know, carry that through in terms of working class people organising. And so there's a battle for ideas playing out, I think, because on the one hand it feels like the left is getting stronger, definitely, you can see that. But you also see those signs of the danger of the polarisation, you know, the Football Lads Alliance, the big mobilisation in Manchester, because people are just, you know, it's a crisis of the system that isn't going to go away. And when you think about, you know, what the Corbyn government would face and so on, I mean, somebody asked the question about, well, not asked the question, made a contribution about which people should be paid what they're worth. Well, actually, the whole system is based on, you know, the exploitation of workers, so we're never going to be paid what we're worth under this system. And that's why we have to get rid of it. And, you know, because workers are exploited in that way, because we produce everything, because they take that surplus value off and they get the profits from our labour, we actually do have the power to completely get rid of capitalism, but also to build a completely different society based on need, not profit, where we just produce things and people live and can enjoy life and so on. And so how do we get from where we are to there? And it can, we stress this thing about the need for the unions to step in, the need for working class struggle to develop, the need for us to resist in that way. And I think there's a question a little bit, because it can feel like at the moment, I think, that there's not necessarily, you can't necessarily see a direct transference from that kind of political upturn expressed around Corbyn into workers realising their power in strikes and so on. And this feels like absolutely crucial, and so I wanted to look to something Rosa Luxemburg said, which I think is quite pertinent in the current situation, where she says, "Every new onset and every fresh victory of the political struggle is transformed into a powerful impetus for the economic struggle, extending at the same time its external possibilities and intensifying the inner urge of the workers to better their position and their desire to struggle. So every foaming wave of political action is after every wave there's a fructifying deposit which remains behind, from which 1,000 stalks of economic struggle shoot forth. The political struggle is the periodic fertilisation of the soil for the economic struggle." And so you can kind of see, we can't see it in terms of that feeding into big mass strikes right now, and that might not necessarily immediately happen in the next few months. But what we can see is the level of politicised mood around the system as a whole, around them and us, around we are the many, they are the few, around the refugee crisis, around all these climate change, all these things that the system is destroying and so on. Problems of the system are exposed, and so I think we don't know what's going to happen with that. But that sharpening polarisation reflected around the whole series of unexpected turns that we've seen in the last few years. We can expect that to continue because the system is in such a state of crisis. And within that, you can actually begin to see, because this is going to push up against working class people's conditions, you can see the potential for a breakthrough of a more combative wave of worker struggles. That's not inevitable at all, but history tells us, and you can look at examples around the world. Somebody mentioned the Indian workers' strike, the fight for 15, hopefully, we're going to hear from the South Korean, where there's been a whole number of general strikes and so on. There will continue to be struggle, and I think that question of how organised we are within that, is very, very, very important. So if people want to be a part of building that kind of new world that we can see, the possibility of reflected in that Corbyn movement, then we're going to have to fight for it, and we're going to have to be organised, and we're going to have to go beyond what the Parliament is able to deliver. And if people want to be a part of building that movement and building that confidence in the idea of workers' power and the ability to change things, then you should join us.